Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast, What's Wrong With? Today, we have the absolute pleasure of speaking with Shamichael Hallman. Shamichael is currently a visiting fellow at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University and a teaching fellow at the Center for Impact Strategy at the University of Pennsylvania. As part of his fellowship work at Harvard, he's exploring how design and planning can make for socially inclusive cities and welcoming public spaces. His 2020 TEDx talk, Reimagining the Public Library to Reconnect the Community, garnered international acclaim among library professionals. In 2021, he co-founded Libraries as Bridges, a collective of library professionals focused on understanding, advancing, and evaluating how libraries build social cohesion, promote civic renewal, and advance the ideals of a healthy American democracy. In this role, he has convened hundreds of library systems from across the country, as well as given talks to organizations such as Urban Libraries Council on the topic of public libraries and American democracy. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of speaking with Shamichael Hallman. He's a visiting fellow at Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. Shamichael, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. We were very much looking forward to this conversation. Can you please introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your background for our audience?
Yeah, I'm Shamichael Hallman, as you said, a current fellow at the Harvard University at the Graduate School of Design. Prior to that, I have done quite a bit of work over the last 6-7 years in public libraries. And then before that, I worked in kind of the large churches, the Black megachurch in the South in the United States, served as an assistant pastor and a chief strategy officer. So I wanted to bring essentially both of those two institutions into my research at Harvard, really recognizing and understanding how both of those institutions play such a huge role, particularly in Black and brown and marginalized under-resourced communities, how both of those institutions really are foundations for the community. I wanted to bring both of those to my research and sort of build ideas around both of those institutions.
I love that. I do want to get into a little bit more about like when you first did the transition from churches to libraries, like what were some of like the synergies you immediately saw since both like serve communities, but I'm going to get into that on my second question. But first, I do want to ask, so when you came into the library space, what are some of the things that you picked up on that were problematic?
Yeah, so I got approached by, this really came into a really wonderful divine encounter with the leadership of the library system in around the middle of 2016. And at that time, they presented me this branch, this historic library branch. So Memphis Public Libraries has 18 locations throughout the city. But Cossitt Library, which is where I was the city's first public library. It's located in the heart of downtown Memphis. It has a really rich history and has been, kind of a pivotal role through the life in the city of Memphis. But the branch was in some ways on the downswing in terms of visitorship, in terms of the range of programs and services that it was offering. And so its relevance in the community was struggling. And so working with library leadership, some amazing library leaders, working with designers, working with the community, we began to put together a plan of, how do we sort of reimagine this space in a way that meets the needs of the community, that makes it a kind of a pillar of the community, a community anchor. And what would it take to do that? Like, how would we have to, push the boundaries of what people thought of what a library should be or could be, as well as, thinking about who we needed to partner with to sort of enhance it and extend the reach of the library system.
Right. And you mentioned low visitorship, I guess,
to
the library. In the research and as you were first like looking into that, were there any like main reasons of that uncovered in that research? And also, I guess this could both apply to like Memphis and to nationwide. Like, what are you observing there?
Sure. Well, for us locally, there were, I think, a couple of things happening. the branch itself was aging, right? And so a lot of the things that people were looking for in terms of services and programs, the space itself couldn't actually meet. Now, that's not to disparage the library or the people that were working there, because I think they were doing a really amazing work. Even before I got there, they were doing some really interesting things. But the space itself lacked some of the visual cues that would make it inviting and would make it welcoming, right? For instance, one of the things that we did when I first got there is we started sort of asking the question, well, who isn't coming in this building? Who is, who are we serving? Well, of course, we always want to understand who are we serving and how could we better serve them. But we also started to ask the question of, who isn't coming through the doors? And so we started doing quite a bit of outreach, quite a bit of community engagement. And some of that happened like on site. So, we were able to essentially walk out the door and stand on kind of a pretty busy intersection and sort of ask people, hey, did you know there was a library here? Have you ever interacted with the library? What are your thoughts on the library? When was the last time you came in? But also we got to sort of, through sort of pop-up programming, doing some a few days here, maybe a week here and there at different businesses, we began to sort of understand what the community was looking for, what the community needed, as well as some of the concerns that they had, right? And so some of the needs were, hey, I'm trying to grow my business, as a creative entrepreneur, and I'm looking for certain tools. I'm looking for, laptops that have creative software. I'm looking for, various sort of crafting and making tools that I could, maybe get my t-shirt business off the ground or get my jewelry business off the ground. The library doesn't really have that. And so that was one thing, from an equipment, a technology, or resource perspective. Well, there was also a very clear sort of class divide, right? I think with most sort of urban, downtown core libraries, there's going to be quite a number of individuals who are coming in who are experiencing homelessness. And many of the people who were not coming in the doors, even though they were not directly saying that, were sort of indirectly or, kind of implicitly, saying, hey, I have concerns. I'm not sure if that area is really safe for me and my family. And of course, we know that much of that is rooted in misinformation and very negative stereotypes. But that's something that we had to deal with. If we wanted to create a space that was truly welcoming and inclusive of all people, then we had to sort of begin to wrestle with these very real things that other people were saying.
So interesting. And you touched upon a point where what we actually discuss even in our studio, right? As a creative studio for us, we have discussed this before, a library, many of the libraries, even around the world today, come from what it was really back in maybe medieval times, right? A lot of books and reading and taking understanding the learning process as only as okay, there will be books and there will be reading and that's it, right? Whereas now you're 3D printing, you might be making stuff, and we were always thinking why isn't the library more like a maker space meets a lot of books and some digital needs, right? So and that seems even an example you're giving is so valid, right? The way we learn or what we want to do today at a library might be very different than historically what we were doing at a library.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, you have all of these sort of trends now that are pressing upon the library. You've got connected, toys, you've got drones, you've got, a whole group of digital natives who think and learn and experience and interact with things differently. You've got, gamification. You've got, we talked about the maker movement, Internet of Things, robots, right? All of these things are sort of coming at the library, pressing upon the library. And the library is trying to, I think in many ways, both here within the U.S., but also globally, trying to figure out and wrestle with, how do we stay true and maintain this sort of foundation of providing open access to knowledge and information, while also meeting some of the new needs or kind of new ways that need is evolving and manifesting itself in our communities.
Yeah, and I think the community aspect is very interesting in the programming that serves a community. I like my reconnection with libraries, I think happened. Well, I would occasionally, I live in New York City. I would occasionally go to a public library here because they're also like either a very scenic area or like the insides are cool or it's like mentioned 20 times on like movies or whatever. So you gotta be there, right?
Yeah.
But also I remember like specifically, there was a time in my life that I was at libraries often, and that was more in like college. And now if I really need to work from somewhere, I can be at a coffee shop because I do have the luxury to like have access to books or like on digital books or ebooks. So, and you're kind of like, do I need to go to a library ever? Like I can't even have coffee there, right? Like, so the working really associated itself with like coffee shops more until I became a mother and I've discovered these, in Brooklyn Public Library or like in Queens, these storytelling for kids.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was the initial like catalyst for me to really just like start going back to the library. And I would take her, and I love that there was like a kids section, which was like, okay, if you were allowed a little bit, right? Like I love that it created that like more age inclusive environment and programming for like kids. So in that sense, like I think that was my first realization of like the importance of programming for a library and how it could serve a community. So with that, I guess like first I will ask my like initial question I had on like what were some of like, oh my God, this is so similar or so different when you move from like churches to libraries first, and then how you see like it serves communities today and how else it could serve.
Yeah, and I think that your story, right, of I heard that really through so many individuals that particularly in Memphis that I spoke with around, having this love for the library, particularly as a child, right? Elementary, middle, high school, you're using the library quite a lot for, reports or, for book reading and those sorts of things. And then for those of us, who went to university or college, often you might have found yourself in the library. And then, sort of beyond college, there's kind of a disconnect, right? Until either you maybe have kids or there's some other sort of thing that puts it back onto your sort of radar, into your map. And I think that is, if we're talking about sort of essentially maybe a problem that the library is experiencing or an opportunity for the library, finding ways again to establish that relevance for folks, kind of beyond, say, 20, mid 20s until, of course, everyone will have kids, but, how do you begin to sort of how you sort of work to help people fall in love again with the public library is something that very much has been at the center of our work. And of course, programming and design and engagement and outreach and so many other things really play into that. But in terms of, the parallels, they were pretty immediate for me. I served at a very large church in sort of the core of Memphis for about 8 years before I started working for the library. And the things that you see in the church are, people are coming for a community, right? They're coming to be in the midst of other people and to have this shared experience together, right? You see people coming from, people from different backgrounds, people who live in different parts of the city by chance, people who, have grown up very differently. But understand like the power of having this shared experience together, of singing together, of reading together, of praying together, right? Of and going, kind of taking sacraments. Like there's just something about how to all those things begin to form and create community. You also see people coming, to learn. They're coming for knowledge. They're coming for information. They're coming to try to figure out, like, man, how do I make sense of life through this faith lens, right? For lots of people, particularly in a city like Memphis, people are also not only coming to experience a thing and to build community, but they often have very real needs. Sometimes people are looking, or needing assistance with food or clothing or shelter, so they're looking to try to see if the church can help them, and if they can't, can they point them in some sort of direction? Can they point them to the social service hub or to some other nonprofit organization that might be able to help them? And so when I started working at the library, it felt very similar to that, right? That I saw people coming in for knowledge and information. People were coming to, get books and learn. I mean, about everything, right? I mean, you've got, you've got self-help books on, how to cook a meal, how to sew, how to knit, but you also just kind of, hey, I've this new wonderful piece of fiction that has come out that I want to read and transport me to some other world, right? But also I begin to see how programming could really bring people together. And that was something that we really, and this is kind of where I'm spending quite a bit of time here at Harvard thinking about, is the power of that shared experience, right? It is so powerful, and particularly within a US context right now, when we are so divided, when we are so polarized, when we are so isolated as we are right now for a number of reasons. We really need those opportunities to have shared experiences with one another. And as I think about, indoor public space, and I saw this, I think I actually may have been at the New York Public Library, and I was speaking with one of the people that worked there, one of the librarians, and she said, that she had saw this quote sometime before that said that the public library was the place that required neither your wallet nor your soul. I said, man, that's just really an amazing way to think about it, right?
Yeah.
And so when I think about, particularly indoor public space, places that have the potential to bring people together, I think the public library is perhaps the greatest indoor public resource that we have in this country and beyond to bring people together.
Definitely. And it's such a good point in terms of like that energy that's just bringing people together in a public space, like you don't necessarily even have to be like singing together, but you could just be like working side by side or reading side by side. And, there's nothing more individualistic than like maybe a meditation experience, but people still go to retreats together and they're in the same space together for that energy, right? So in that sense, it presents such a great opportunity to become that center, which is also like democratizing, right? Because it's really enabling access. And you don't necessarily, you can be from like any background or any community, and you could just like come in. And in that way, it's like one of the rare spaces I feel like left in our like public space, because there are a lot of also like so-called public spaces in all, cities in US where it's mainly driven by retail, which is not necessarily accessible to all. So in that way, it's like one of the like rare spaces left. And maybe like as a design studio for us, obviously we're always fascinated. You mentioned design a few times. Obviously design of a public space is, a huge factor in attracting people, but also maybe creating a feeling with people, right? And I remember, I think it was Helsinki in Finland, when I went to like their public library there to just like see the design, because it was great design. I remember thinking this, oh my God, if my university library was like this, I would have spent even more time there. Like it was like a clear, but I could be biased, I'm part of a design studio, so maybe it like matters to me even more. But now, like as you're talking, I'm thinking of design not only just like the wow aesthetics, but also in terms of functionality. If we're talking about how like programming, and I guess like diverse programming or programming that is resilient, right? Like our needs at times change, but still we need some sort of programming from each public space. How do you see this like physical space evolving as books become more digital, as the programming varies? What kind of needs do you have from the physical space to like evolve within public libraries?
One of the questions that I brought to Harvard was, and I'm still sort of, my thoughts around this are still evolving a little bit, but I've always sort of wondered, even with all the work that we did to make that branch, feel as welcoming and inclusive as it could be, I've always wondered, how could I better measure the publicness of this space, right? And I think the question that I've had is that, if this is truly this wonderful and inclusive public space, what would happen if on any given day everybody showed up? From all different cultures, from all different perspectives, from all different beliefs. Like what would happen if everybody just for whatever reason, like a representation of every sort of thought, ideology, background, socioeconomic Like, what if all those people showed up on any given that like could we even handle that, right? Um, and that led me to one of the really great resources that I found was there was a social scientist here in the 50s and 60s and I think into the 70s who wrote this really wonderful book called The Nature of Prejudice, where he talked about encounters. We talked about kind of interactions. You talked a minute ago about, how this sort of need to sometimes you just sort of want to be in a space reading with other people who are reading, right? But sometimes you want to be in a space doing something else. Like you want to be, shoulder to shoulder, learning a new skill, learning a new hobby, trying a new food, watching a play or a show together, right? And so that requires a space to be very flexible, first off, right? And so for us, what that meant was that we got rid of all of our wooden bookshelves. All right, so all of our shelving is on movable casters. We can very quickly, very easily, if we need to roll the books to a corner and pop up chairs and tables, we can do that, right? But we also have these very sort of larger multi-use spaces that can become many different things, right? So for instance, on the second floor of the library in downtown Memphis, we have this multi-use space that has about 8 different configurations, right? So on one day, it could be set up so that we could do a film screening, right? And then the next day, it could be set up so that we could have a corporate gathering there, like a mini retreat. And then the next day, it could be set up so that we could do a theatrical performance, right? And so you see just sort of the range of things that you can do that might attract different people. So I think it is both this sort of need to be flexible, but this also kind of foundational pieces that allow the library to sort of have some of it's still sort of identity, right? I think is where we landed, and so for us, in addition to these very flexible spaces, we also added a cafe, right? Because a lot of people, what we heard was folks who would say, hey, it would be great to have a place where I could study, where I could do work, and coffee was available, but I didn't feel like I had to buy coffee to stay there, right? Like that if I didn't buy another cup of coffee, people looking at me crazy, and it's like, okay, it's time for you to leave now because you haven't bought the next cup of cappuccino, right? So it's like, okay, well, I want it'd be great to have that, right? And then we also added, I think things that you're seeing, certainly that I'm sure you saw in Helsinki, but these sort of maker spaces, places to be able to record audio and video, places to be able to tinker, to be able to make, places to be able to gather and work. We even actually have co-working spaces that actually have lockable storage, so you could actually check out a hot desk for the day, in case you want to be in kind of in the midst of other people as you do your work. And so that's a little bit of what we did. And I will also say, lastly, we made the place very beautiful. I mean, we tried to take every piece of, every amount that we had and figure out, how do we make this as beautiful as we can? How can we ensure or help the public compete with the private when it comes to beauty and aesthetic and those sorts of things?
I love all of those. And I love also you mentioned, the keeping some features that also just identifies as a library and it's like foundation, because I was thinking as you were talking about like, movable shelves, I thought, oh, that's super flexible and cool. And then I'm like imagining, the library and like Beauty and the Beast, right? I'm like, but no more those. And then
Yeah.
something.
Yeah, so we did kind of in one section of the library keep a wooden shelving where we have some of our rare books and we have some art that the library has. And so with that, we were able to, to really kind of keep that touch. And we found that really resonated with particular audiences. Like there was some people that they really wanted to see that and really needed to see that, reminded them of the library. And so it was important for us to
Yeah.
incorporate
Yeah.
that
I don't
into the
know if
design.
that's like a temporary, like transitional thing, like us, maybe like millennials kind of like still romanticize that, but maybe Gen Z and ours, they'll be like, okay, where do I download a book? And then
Right, right. What, yeah. What do I plug in my phone? Where do I record my TikTok? Right. That's what they're, yeah.
Or maybe, we'll create spaces where like holograms are like doing like audiobooks or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, in terms of like those, like the flexibility, multi-use, larger spaces that we can like adapt easily. And I guess like some, both like, I guess like unique experiences that could be like, oh, this is a library, but also you mentioned like beauty, right? Like culturally or locally, whatever that means, incorporating that. So it just becomes a space where you like feel great. And I love you mentioned cafe, because like that's my, like, I remember I think I was at like Queen's Library once, and thinking I need a quiet like workspace today, and I wanted to change scenery, and Queen's Library, the new one, has great view, so I was like, okay, I'm going to go there. But I'm so used to working from like coffee shops. I'm like eating a muffin, right? And then somebody comes over and they're like, you can't eat here. I'm like, what?
Yeah.
This is outrageous.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, I mean, that's part of the, I think, tension that exists, right? Because, you are not, I think most of us are not used to being able to eat or drink in a library. And so
Yeah.
adding a cafe adds an element. I mean, not only does it add an element of, okay, we now have to wrestle with, where is food and drink allowed in the space, but we also now have to, begin to contend with what does that do to the noise factor of the space, right? Because there are people who, solely are coming because they need a quiet space, right? But then you have other people who are like, no, hey, I'm welcome to noise, right? And so for us, not only did that come out through design in terms of the cafe is an open space, and so when you walk in the library, the cafe is on the first floor, you're going to hear noise. You hear people talk. So it feels a little sort of jarring to some people to be like, oh, hold up, what's going on? This is not the library that I'm used to, right?
Yeah.
But then for us to also create pockets, to create, so again, we have 3 spaces that are quiet rooms. And one of these quiet rooms could be either the way that we've designed it is, it could be this sort of reading room where there are chairs. And this particular room has a beautiful view of the Mississippi River. It has one of the most amazing views in all of downtown. So we created this to sort of be a quiet reading room, but that it could also be a meeting room. Like, so, if you needed that, bring in 4 or 5 folks and sit down and have a meeting, hash things out, you could do that as well, right? So again, sort of trying to create that flexibility of even making sure that the type of furniture that we have in there is something that could easily be broken down, so that this room could become different things based off of the needs of the community.
Yeah. No, I think there was something to your point, what you said, like in the design phase and understanding your community and their needs. Like I think I would assume you would definitely know better that many of the libraries could use a renovation or a touch up, right? And like both, I'm sure in US and globally. But at the same time, it does call for, even though there could be some universal elements that could very resonate with every library, right? Like having flexible spaces to do whatever you need, but also this element of co-creation with like communities, right? Like really having a community based and community-led design process to understand like who is visiting the most, what do they need, and also who is not visiting and why, exactly what you were like saying. So to that point, I guess, do you have any add or advice on, how that community engagement process during the renovations could happen? Given I'm sure, especially when we talk about public library, I'm sure a lot of that renovation is contingent upon some funding that is available. But once that's there, how can libraries most effectively use that budget to adapt for the future?
Yeah, there's so many things that we did that I just feel really proud of, and that act of co-creation is so important. And I think it's important to remember that when that for me anyway, to do co-creation right, it means that you have to give up a little bit of power, right? That I feel like I see instances where people want to do co-creation more so to be able to say they did it, than to really get, and so you've got to give up a little bit of power. And so what that looked like for us, we had one particular staff member, Emily Marks, who just got this. She just nailed this. She, in that, I told you, that multi-use space that we have on the second floor, where performances and stuff. She, over about a 3.5-month period, interviewed both on-site and then off-site over 100 artists or arts organizations, and just said, hey, this is kind of what we're thinking about with this space. What would you need? How would you use this space, right? And what she heard over and over again was people saying, hey, we need spaces as artists that are accessible, that are affordable, and that are inclusive. Like, that we need all three of those things, right? Because people would saying, what she was hearing was that some artists would say, well, hey, there's this space in this part of town, I can afford to go there. The things that I need are there. But as a person of color, when I walk in, the people that own the space are locking stuff up. And that doesn't feel very inclusive at all, right? Or they were saying, hey, there's a space on this other side of town that is very inclusive. But the cost is so high that if I get this space, I'm going to have to, jack the ticket price up in such a way where the people that I want to be able to see this art won't be able to see it, right? And so what that sort of became for us was using that space in a way that allowed artists to kind of create a co-op model, kind of this mutual aid model that says, hey, we won't charge you to use this space, and if we do it, it will be very little. And you can rehearse here, you can perform here, you can do your thing here. And what we will ask, instead of, paying these very large fees, is that you make sure that your programming is accessible to the community, right? And so, that if you've got to charge, let's try to do that stuff after hours. And then, like, kind of during library hours, the things that you're doing, whether those are shows or workshops or whatever, those things are free to the community, right? And for some people, that presented a barrier. But for most of the organizations, they said, no, we can do that. That actually makes a lot of sense to us, right? And so that act of co-creation now, essentially, I think we've gotten to a place where artists and arts organizations will do most of the programming out of that space. And so librarians are now freed up to just do what librarians do best, which is find ways to serve the people who are coming through the doors, right? And so that is, I think, that act of co-creation that has now led to co-programming models is really, really interesting, right? But other things that we did, our building was closed for quite some time just because the renovation posed many challenges. And that sort of forced us to go off-site. And so there were a number of small businesses, such as a local food hall, that said, hey, we've got space here. You can come here and do a program. You can come here and do a thing. And so with that local food hall, they gave us about 200 square feet. And we essentially put a pop-up library there. We brought in rolling bookshelves, and we had books that people could check out. We had coloring sheets for kids. We had midday stress relieving activities for people who worked running around the space. We had this tack board that asks people, hey, what do you want to see in this new library? Who are your favorite authors? When you think about books that you would just sit down and immerse yourself in, what would they be? What sort of colors do you find representative of Memphis? When you think about Memphis, what pops to mind? And so through that, just being in a space that was not our own, we encountered people who said, hey, I had no idea there was a library that was that close to me. I would love to come and be a part of that library, right? And that sort of allowed us to start having conversations with folks that we would not have otherwise had conversations with. So I think the degree to which you can say, this is one thing to sort of set a table and say, hey, come to our table and talk to us and convene with us and break bread with us. It's another thing to find out where the other tables are and say, hey, can I come sit at your table and just listen to what's happening and you're a part of the community, right?
Yeah, I love that so much. I mean, so many of the things that you mentioned, I'm glad you highlighted kind of power sharing, right? I think it's like essential to be able to realize a successful co-design process. Otherwise, it is really no different than focus groups, which historically in any industry, we see that they're not really effective.
Sure.
And I love how you mentioned, that like co-creation of the space kind of leading into co-programming because of the sense of ownership that rises from that co-creation process, right? Like, why shouldn't they want to engage more? They were actively involved in the decision making of what that space should be for. So it only makes so much sense, they would want to actually use the space. And not only that, but also in time of need, like to, spearhead other collaborations and like offsite. And just because of that, like authentic opportunity of collaboration and really feeling that it was more like a partnership process rather than you guys going in just like poking people for like questions and then doing in the end whatever you felt like was appropriate, right? So
yeah. And I mean, I'll say one other thing on that. I think it's important. The thing that I think perhaps we knew, but just we didn't. It wasn't top of mind. Is that once you start that relationship, you've got to continue to cultivate it, right? You can't just say, okay, hey, the building's done now, everybody go back to normal. Like, you've got to find ways to intentionally cultivate and nurture that relationship. It's very, very important to think about that from a leadership perspective. How do we continue to maintain and nurture this relationship?
That's great that you mentioned that, because I feel like, as a more like boutique studio that practices a lot of, co-design in projects, what we find our role kind of becomes a little bit also almost like a mediator, just because like we come in and generally if we're working for a larger institution and there's like this effort of like understanding or creating solutions for a community, there's huge distrust there because of what you just mentioned, right? There's generally these like one-off interactions and not necessarily follow-up or effort to like cultivate a relationship, which creates distrust in communities, sometimes even trauma. And therefore, like, we have to kind of like, we find ourselves trying to navigate that and see how we can carry over the insights that we're getting from the community to really convey that to the institutions, to also tell them, look, like this work has to continue after we leave too. And I think that's also so crucial for a library, just because it is a community center, right? If you don't cultivate that relationship, you're basically hurting your own business.
Indeed.
This is so great. I do want to be mindful of time, so I'm going to get to the last part where I do want to ask your advice for anyone who wants to make change, push boundaries, push for progress in any field that they're in. What would be your advice to them?
Oh, wow. Well, if I think particularly specifically about the library project that I was part of, I give a lot of credit to leadership. Right. I don't think that project could have happened without the director of the library, Keena McCloy, who essentially not only brought me and my team on, but said, hey, I trust you to make the right decision. Like, I can't be involved in the day-to-day because there's just so many other things that are happening, but I trust you, and I'm going to give you the flexibility to experiment and to try things. And I'm okay with that, right? And so I think that, I think if you're hearing this as a leader, I would say to, absolutely do your due diligence. And, if you're hiring, just make sure you find the right person. But then once you've hired people and they're good people, give them the freedom to go and try stuff, right? In a way that doesn't penalize them if it doesn't work out, in a way that just says, hey, this is going to get us one step closer to this ultimate place that we want to be, right? So that fact that not only did she, sort of have, okay, hey, this is the North Star, this is what this looks like, this is what success looks like, but that sort of freedom to try was really, really important. And then I would think, from myself, I think what was really important was to not be afraid to try things, to not be afraid, knowing that I had the support of leadership. Now, that might have been a different story if I didn't have that level of support. But knowing that I had that support, I said, okay, well, we've got to begin to sort of ask these what-if questions, right? Like, one of the things that we thought about was, the name of the place is Cossitt Library. And for instance, for a long time, we asked the question, okay, well, what if we remove the library? What if we just called it the Cossitt? So that people who had never interacted with the library, or people who had interacted with the library and said, oh, I know what the library is about, had to sort of think, okay, well, hey, if it doesn't say library, like, okay, maybe I've got to go inside and just kind of see what they're doing in there, right?
I love that.
That's sort of kind of this big sort of what if. What if we change the name? What if we made this something very different than what we've thought about before? Those sort of big what if questions, I think, paid off for us in a big way.
So being free to, well, I guess for like leaders, giving the space for your team to try things, but also as an individual, just being free to ask the what if questions to see where it might take you. Yeah.
And that question really led to us bringing in a lot of different people. We, not only did we do, sort of the co-creation and focus groups, but we also, because of the funding that we had at the time, we also gave out micro grants. And we said, hey, the space is under construction right now. It's not where it would be complete right now. We're going to give you an opportunity to pitch your idea of what you would want to do here. If you had $500 and you could do whatever you want to do in the space, what would you do, right? And people came and did stuff. People came and did hip hop yoga. People came and did outdoor painting series. People came and did self-defense classes, for kids, where they put on superhero costumes. They got to sort of be their own superhero and learn self-defense, right? And that was also very interesting because it helped us see, oh, okay, this is how people view this. Like we view this in one particular way, but the community views this in a completely different way. And where is their synergy? How might we, kind of take all of this and create a space that people really love and resonate with?
Yeah. I love these so much. I wish I was like one of those, like in the workshops of like superhero self.
It was so amazing. It was really cool because the kids got to create their own superheroes. So this person, sort of talked to kids about, some of their favorite superheroes, and then they talked about, design, and so the kids kind of made their own superhero costumes, and then they did this martial arts workshop, which was really cool, and then, sort of like the call was like, okay, hey kids, like, now know what superheroes do. They go and save communities. They go and work in their communities, right? So you take all the stuff that you learned and go back to where you came from, go back to your community, go back to your neighborhood and see what you can do to make your neighborhood better. Maybe it's a trash pickup or recycling campaign, right? And so it was really, really cool to see, just how people viewed things they could do in the library,
I love that so much. Shamichael, this was amazing. Thank you so much. Thanks for making the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We look forward to, seeing more of your research coming out and see what things you will uncover and recommend for the future of libraries. And we'll definitely be on the watch out.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. And that is this week's episode of What's Wrong with the Podcast. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Links can be found in the episode description, and you can also find them on our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz. If you found value in the show, we would appreciate if you could rate us and leave a review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Don't forget to join us next week. Thank you for listening.